So thank you all for being here. It's great to see such a big crowd of people. As Marcus mentioned, my name's Scott Kirchner. I've been covering both the startup and the big company innovation ecosystem in Boston for a long time. Was out in Silicon Valley covering that ecosystem for a few years. So MIT, I just love it. I love these events that ILP does. I just want to ask maybe to start off for a big round of applause for these panelists, but also the ILP people who put on this fantastic event. Okay? Yeah. I also want to just say hi to all of the people listening on simultaneous translation. Raise your hand if you're listening on simultaneous translation today. We'll see how slow the simultaneous translation is based on this. I know there are some of you.
I feel like I should raise my hand, Scott.
Yeah, Ryan needs simultaneous. I know there's some people in the back, but maybe they're just shy, or like 20 minutes from now, we're going to see a hand go up. So I have these incredible panelists up here. We are supposed to talk about kind of the role that bigger companies play in the Boston innovation ecosystem. So my objective really is to talk about that topic, but I would love to take a lot of pigeonhole questions from you. So we'll involve those, weave those in at any point. So just start entering your questions, or you can also heckle us on Pigeonhole. You can place bets about whose chair might collapse first. Mine is pretty wobbly. Yeah, don't do that, Brian. So let me introduce these panelists from your left to the right here. All the way on the left, we have Hervé Couret. He is the EVP and Chief Digital Officer of Schneider Electric, which is the energy management company, about $27 billion in revenue, with offices here in the Boston area, Hong Kong, Paris, and the rest of the world. One down, Brian Rosnov from Philips HealthWorks. It is a breakthrough innovation accelerator and an open innovation initiative inside of Philips Healthcare, but he's based here in Cambridge. One down, Stas Gation. He is the founder of CIC Boston, a managing director at CIC, which is one of those traditional co-working spaces we were just talking about. But Stas is working on international expansion for them. And they are expanding to cities like Warsaw, Poland, Sydney, Australia, Tokyo, Japan. You're already in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, so welcome, Stas. And then finally, all the way on the end here, we have Reshma Shetty. She is Chief Operating Officer and co-founder at Ginkgo Bioworks. It's the company, if you need an organism designed, perhaps today, perhaps next week, they're the company to go to here in Boston. They have raised $430 million in funding so far. Some of it from Bill Gates. They have about 200 employees, so welcome, Reshma. Thank you guys all for being here. Again, Pigeonhole at any point for your questions about the innovation ecosystem here. But I mean, I guess the one quick question I would love to ask of the two folks representing larger companies, why does your company have a presence in Boston? Kind of what strategic value does it have? Let's start with Schneider.
Sure. Well, it's interesting because actually we started via acquisition. I mean, the company made a number of large acquisitions in the Boston area, starting with Andover Controls, American Power Conversion, which is an MIT, which was founded around MIT, and then Invensys, who had a very large presence here in the Boston area. So through those successive acquisitions, we ended up building pretty large presence here in Boston. I think we have a little less than 2,000 employees in the larger,
Did you
area.
call this your North American headquarters, or is it just one of the company's three headquarters?
So it's interesting because, yeah, we believe in connected leadership. So we do have 3 leadership hubs. So one in Boston, one in Paris, one in Hong Kong. We have a number of satellites as well in Singapore, for instance, and over. But yes, it's one really of a 3 area. And we have spread our leadership team across those hubs so that we do have people that sort of wake up and breathe in different environment when it comes to innovation
And if you were to say, aside from the acquiring in products and talent here in Boston, like what are one or two of the other sort of objectives that Schneider Electric has in this ecosystem? Like, are you investing in startups? Are you?
So yes, I mean, there's a couple of things. I would say first, it's a pretty big R&D center for us. So out of the 2,000 people that I was mentioning, we have a lot of R&D folks. And we don't believe in sort of R&D in isolation from their ecosystem, right? So we're trying as well to really benefit from the ecosystem. So from a few angles. So of course, startup relationship we've built over the years, a number of very strong relationship with startups in the area. Sense, for instance, a startup which is here in Cambridge, KGS would be another one, and so forth. So really the startup element in the ecosystem. We also work with incubators, so Greentown Labs in Somerville would be one, which is pretty important in the clean tech space. And lastly, of course, academics, right?
Yeah.
So we do work closely with MIT, with ILP, but not only, over research center in the MIT Federation.
Yeah.
So we try really to, embed ourselves in the ecosystem through a number of angles and sort of nurture our own innovation, our own teams, our ideas.
So you mentioned Greentown Labs, which is a couple miles from here in Somerville.
Correct.
I think that is one of the biggest clean tech energy incubators in the
the
world
US,
that I've run into.
Absolutely.
I know there's the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, but
There's one in Seattle as well. So there's a few more. I don't know all of them, but definitely it's a very significant one.
yeah, thanks for mentioning that. So Brian, how about Philips, this Dutch company that I don't think came here by acquisition, right?
Well, I mean, acquisition back in the late 90s, early 2000s when we acquired Hewlett-Packard's assets. So we've been actually in the Boston, greater Boston area for quite a while. Up in Andover, had a large campus, facilities out in Framingham as part of Lifeline acquisition, both on the lighting side and on the healthcare side. But the business has been changing quite a bit. And several years ago, there was a strategic decision that as we're evolving from a very device-oriented company to a software and solutions-based company, we need to move closer to where the talent is and where our partners are. And so for us, the move into Cambridge started 2015. Actually, I used to run a business in Andover, moved into Cambridge as part of that first team, and have now expanded that operation both on the research side, on the business side, on the commercial side. We're in the process of opening up a new headquarters, North American headquarters, over in Cambridge Crossing, which should be opening early 2020. So we're moving about 3,000 employees into Cambridge. Traffic will be great, so come visit us. But
Yeah, I'm thinking about that one little bridge that goes from Charlestown to Cambridge.
Yeah.
But you're close enough now that you could paddleboard from
I
here
walked
to
over
your
here.
office,
Absolutely,
right?
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I walked over here, so.
Awesome. I want to, there's already some good Pigeonhole questions. I want to bribe you for more Pigeonhole questions and votes because I brought some cool little Post-it notebooks that I'm going to give out to a couple Pigeonhole question askers. But on the here versus Silicon Valley question, before we ask that, I would love to have you put a finer point on that and explain kind of what you mean. So if you want to either raise your hand or do it by Pigeonhole, the trade-off of having a corporate hub here versus Silicon Valley, is that what you mean? Yes? Someone raise your hand if this was your question. Are people asking Pigeonhole questions from other conferences, maybe? I don't know. They love the
translation, actually.
They love the cloak of anonymity.
Faculty meeting next door is asking questions.
All right. No one wants to own up to that question, even if I'm trying to bribe you with a free Post-it notebook. Okay, you asked the question.
No, but I voted for it.
Okay. So how do you?
It's the one vote.
So how do you want us to? How do you want us to pose that question?
Tech versus life science and the amount of money involved.
Yeah.
Where would you locate your startup?
Okay, that's great. Hey, Nevin, do you mind handing this notebook back to that fellow? Can you be my Vanna White? I've only got 3, but I want to bribe you guys. So Reshma, why don't you take that? Because you guys started here in Boston. You went out to Y Combinator in Silicon Valley for, 6 months or so? And so from the life sciences side, your company's in this really interesting synthetic biology space where I don't think there was an established cluster here yet, and there probably wasn't in the Valley. How would you compare and contrast on the life sciences side?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say a little bit depends on what your goals are, right? So for us, we always knew that we wanted to build a world-changing technology company, right? We wanted to build the next Google or Intel or whatnot, but in the area of making GMOs, right? Engineering biology. And so for us, Boston had a few advantages and honestly a few disadvantages. From the advantages side, I think here, like there's an appetite to tackle tough problems by the talent around here, right? So in terms of like attracting folks to like, hey, we have this really hard mission to make biology easier to engineer. Do you want to come join us on this journey and stick with it for a while? Like I think the talent, the students, and the folks around here like are up for that kind of challenge, right? Whereas I think in Silicon Valley, there's a little bit more of a I'm going to go do my 2 years at a startup and then move to the next one because I want to collect as many option bets as I can across startups, right? So in terms of building a sustaining company that's really tackling hard problems, I think it's ideal. I think the place where the biggest disadvantage I see is if you're a founder wanting to start up a new company, particularly in the pharma biotech space, it can be really hard to raise money around here. So for example, our first round we raised exclusively out of Silicon Valley because there folks were willing to fund companies who wanted to take big bets. Oh yeah, everybody wants to build the next Amazon or the next Intel. It's sort of assumed, whereas you talk to investors around here and it's like, you're getting a little too big for your britches, I think, with that one.
They want you to solve a really specific business problem.
They want me to solve a really specific problem, and they want me to flip the company in a few years so that they can make their return and go on to the next asset to flip. And so the investors, I think, they're like the founders here are ambitious, but I don't think the investor community is as ambitious.
Yeah. Stas, I want to bring you in a second, but I'm curious, Hervé, if you and Schneider have spent some time in Silicon Valley, would you take a pass at this question? Because I feel like you see a lot of corporates that open innovation labs or R&D centers in Silicon Valley. Often they're viewed as like outsiders, right? Because they're not the next great, Intel, Apple success story. Whereas I feel like in Boston, they're a little bit more woven into the community and kind of welcomed as like, hey, you might be an investor, you might be an acquirer. There's less of that us versus them phenomenon here.
I think that's true. It's interesting because we try to do both. So we also have an office in the Valley, and we have a small corporate venture arm out there. But they don't invest exclusively in the Valley, of course. So we try to breathe in different ecosystems. What we see really probably a couple of differences. One is again back to the critical mass, right? We have a lot of people here, so there's a lot of might not always be an investment, but it can just be a cooperation, a partnership, etc. But when you have a bigger mass of business people, there's so many more opportunity to basically create something and partner together. So that would be one thing. The other thing that I find interesting in the Boston area is probably not, you have a pretty large area of technologies around here. You have storage, battery, you have material science, so not only just sort of digital technologies, but I think the array of technologies that are invested here on the academic presence around here is pretty wide. And we like this idea of not just being centered on the digital part, but link it with some other discipline. So that would be two of the things that I would highlight.
I guess, Brian, before you jump in or before Stas jumps in, I want to broaden the question and say if it's not just let's compare Boston and Silicon Valley, but let's talk about other ecosystems in the world, whether it's Beijing, whether it's Amsterdam, whether it's Tokyo, where you guys are, just kind of like strengths or comparisons to other innovation ecosystems.
Yeah, I mean, again, what we liked here was one, we have a great partner at MIT, so really that was important to us. We have the benefit of assets nearby. It's a place all of our executives want to be. And frankly, it's just the compression of the ecosystem, it's just easy to get things done. It's from our perspective, whether it's big company to small company, whether it's executive meetings, partnership meetings. We have plenty of hospital collaborators here. It's very unique. That doesn't really exist in any other ecosystem. So for us, we've concentrated our innovation assets here in Eindhoven, which is our sort of center of innovation in the company, in Shanghai and in Bangalore. But there's really some unique characteristics here that not only allow us to take advantage of it, but frankly, it's a nice crossroads of all the talent we see around the world.
Yeah. Interesting.
So, look, I think if you go back to the original question and say, what's the interesting thing about startups and large corporates partnering, right? And why does that happen here in ways that it doesn't happen in other places? I think there's just a very, very basic fundamental reality that I think we all have to admit, which is this. There is no such thing as a small company that sells to the world. Only large companies sell to the world. So as a small startup building something, you have one of two choices. Either you partner with a large company, whether you sell to them, you become a division of them, you get an investment from them, or you become a large company yourself. There is no other way to access the entire world because the world is big, it's complicated, people speak multiple languages, there are different regulatory systems, and that is irrespective of product. That's just as true for digital products as it is for biotech, as it is for hardware, as it is for robotics. And even look at companies as well-funded as Uber and the difficulties they've had breaking into various parts of the world and even pulling out of parts of the world like Southeast Asia and China for Uber and and such. So the fundamental reason for the partnership between small and large is that large companies have the ability to engineer solutions globally and oftentimes have sales teams and sales forces. And so it's a very easy way to become a global vendor almost overnight. On the other hand, obviously, if you're a small company growing globally, if you give up everything to a large partner, then who are you and what are you doing? If you look at ecosystems globally, one of the really, really interesting things, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, but we have a pretty collaborative design here. So I think a lot of the corporate venture folks here have had realizations that are quite different from what has happened in a lot of other parts of the world. There are a lot of parts of the world where people have said, look, if you want to partner with me, you must come into my corporate incubator, which has a box and it has walls. And there are companies, in fact, in Boston that have done this, only to find that it doesn't actually work all that well because it turns out that the most interesting entrepreneurs have no interest in being inside the four walls of a single corporate partner or friend. What they're really interested in is engaging with a far larger ecosystem because if I'm working only with one large company, then that's the only potential acquirer, and every other company, even in there, every one of their competitors is going to look and say, hey, look, if you're in the, let's make up a company, if you're in the Nike incubator, then why would I, as Puma, invest in you if Nike hasn't invested?
Yeah.
Because why would I, because what would they do? Why aren't they seeing an opportunity that I'm seeing? What do they know that I don't know?
Well, it's interesting. So I want to just highlight a point you made, which is a lot of times the companies that come into these corporate incubators for free office space, this ties into the last question during Israel's session, are the weakest startups. That if you can't figure out how to find office space, like what is your chance of succeeding as a startup? I mean, I'm not joking at all. I've been to a lot of these corporate incubators in Waltham in the suburbs and in downtown Boston, and you see these startups that are sort of like two people who've been bumbling around an opportunity for 15 years, but they like free office space. The one exception I would point out is something like Lab Central, where Johnson & Johnson may sponsor your startup to have free lab space for a while as they're kind of poking around and seeing, do we want to invest in it? Do we want to have a collaboration? And maybe it's like in the biotech life sciences world, just lab space is so expensive and hard to find that you see some high quality companies coming through there.
I'd say the main difference there is Lab Central isn't branded. So it's not the Johnson & Johnson incubator.
Right.
It's Lab Central. And so whoever gives you the funding, they're an investor and they're no different from any other investor, right? Yeah. So an investor gives you free space is just another type of investor, but because the space isn't branded, you're not seen as being an agent of only one company. And that's really, really critical for the excellent founders, because the excellent founders don't want to be locked into a single corporate patron's opportunity. This is not the 1400s in Venice, with the Medici family is not, and is not backing your biotech startup.
And in terms of office space, the one thing I've seen, which is totally crazy, I mean, first of all, startups are really good at just subletting from other companies that have extra space, that have taken an extra 1,000 or 2,000 square feet. But I did go visit a startup in an apartment building in Kendall Square once, and they were like, hey, we're happy to let you write about us in your Boston Globe column because the landlord already knows we're running our company illegally from this apartment and they're throwing us out. But, they had like 2 good years operating out of an apartment over on like Binney Street, I think. Let's take this next question with 5 votes, which I think is great because it's cynical like me. What do you think is missing in the Cambridge ecosystem? Is there any process or institute that you've seen in innovation ecosystems around the world that you would want to implement here? Do you want to raise your hand and I'll reward you for asking that awesome question? Okay. In the red, Nevin, stay awake here. What's missing? You just have come from around the world. Reshma, you've been a lot of places. Hervé, I presume you're pretty well traveled. What's missing here that you've seen other places?
I think the The VC part is probably not as well structured as what you can see in the Valley or in other area. I mean, we tend to have probably more relationships with VC in the Bay Area than we have over here. So that's probably the part that I would see the weakest.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'd say what's missing here that we talk about as much. I'm heavily involved in Mass Challenge. I'm sort of on the board of health tech, and I think if we'd be an even better ecosystem if around the startups our corporate partners could actually collaborate, right? So I think a typical startup isn't looking just for Philips or Schneider or one. There's really an ecosystem of partners they're trying to pull together, and I think if we could bring together, we struggle to find a way to partner together around the talent in the ecosystem.
Yeah,
frankly.
yeah, and it's
I
interesting.
don't know. I haven't seen a great model yet.
Right.
But
Right. I mean, I think all large organizations have trouble working with others because they feel like, look, our strategic needs are what matters most. I think the level I would go down to in healthcare is you hear a lot about the hospitals.
Right.
You know, they all have their own innovation initiative, or they're trying to spin out companies in their own way, and they hold their annual innovation conference where they're trying to showcase their IP. And why does that need to be a separate initiative for the Brigham and Mass General and Dana-Farber? But do you guys have a take on this question?
Yeah, I would say one of the key things that I think is missing from the Boston ecosystem is that we don't have enough companies that have sort of scaled from nothing up to, say, $10 billion, $50 billion, and so on, right? Because I think seeing that experience inspires investors and inspires other founders and inspires the whole ecosystem to go for that scale and that ambition. And I think we just don't have enough examples of that. And even in terms of mentorship and having people who've lived through that and who can mentor the next generation of founders that are trying to scale beyond,
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I often think you do feel that scaling DNA is so strong in the Valley of people who've done it before. And in Boston, I feel like we're really strong on the discovery DNA. It's like the love of being in the lab at the bench, writing the first code to do X, Y, and Z. And it's like, well, maybe we could find somebody to scale this. Let's find somebody who used to work at, Polaroid or Digital Equipment or Lotus or whatever.
Well, I think, and I actually just want to echo 2 points that you've made because I think they're really brilliant, and I want to just underscore them. I think on the VC side and the scaling side, these two are closely tied together. So I think the general theory of VC in the Valley is, let's go invest in 1,000 companies. One of them will be Uber. The other 999 will fail, and who cares? And so what it means is people are searching for the really crazy return. And by the way, the downside of that is you end up killing a bunch of really good companies that could be $100 million or $500 million companies, but they're not going to be Uber. So let's just kill them, in their sleep. Where I think in Boston, what we have is an appreciation for those companies, but not necessarily the willingness to fund the moonshot companies, the Facebooks and the Ubers of the world, which is why we've seen those kind of companies sometimes leave. And what that translates into is we don't have the infrastructure. We've had a lot of companies scale from 0 to 1,000 employees. We've not had a lot of companies scale from 1,000 to 20,000 employees. And that's something where I think there's a big question around, do we have the people to scale, not from 0 to 1,000, because for sure, do we have the ability to have the corporate headquarters with the most brilliant people in the world? Yeah, 100%, no question. But do we have the next 9,000 employees? And that's a really big question around scaling. And what we've seen is a lot of the companies that have grown up here, when they have mega scaled, they've mega scaled elsewhere. And so they'll keep their corporate headquarters here, they'll keep their super talented staff, they'll keep their engineering. In fact, other companies are bringing engineering to Boston saying, hey, look, this is where all the smart people are. But the question is, are we doing enough for everybody else? Are we building an ecosystem that consists only of nerds and service providers, or are we dealing with an economy that includes a more broad-based prosperity? And I think that's a really big question we're not really dealing with, and it's driving up our housing and a bunch of other costs in ways that are quite destructive to our social fabric.
Yeah, that's a bunch of big points there, and they lead into this next question about infrastructure, so maybe you were doing an intentional segue. This is my last little Post-it notebook. Whose question is the infrastructure one? This is really good.
All the way in the back.
All the way in the back, the person okay, Nevin, you're gonna get some exercise here. So Boston is small and its infrastructure is choking. How does industry join government to truly address this? I feel like we're seeing, just to give you guys time to think a little bit, I mean, we're seeing some point solutions where, over in the seaport, there are some companies that are saying let's fund a water shuttle to get people from North Station, the commuter rail train station hub, over to the Seaport District because there isn't a really good bus or train connection. You see some companies like Biogen running private bus fleets to get people from the suburbs to Cambridge, which is like taking people off of the infrastructure. But I mean, there was a lot in there, like housing, transportation. Are we seeing industry kind of, leaning in enough on this stuff?
So can I start on this? I think this is something where we are desperate for better vision. And we are missing on a political level the vision to solve these problems. And it's so, I will say, speaking only for myself, it is so deeply frustrating. So we have had, I don't know if you guys remember, of just a few, I guess now a little bit more than a year ago, there was a question about whether when the red line gets upgraded, whether it was going to get upgraded with fast signaling, which would be locked in place for either the next 3 or 5 decades. And it would allow the trains to run much faster and more close to one another. But if you didn't make the purchase at the moment of buying the new trains, you couldn't do it for 3 decades. And so, we're talking about this, and we're talking about West Station being pushed to 2040 or 2050. And for folks, that's the station where BU meets Harvard, where the Mass Pike is going to get reconfigured. And we're talking about maybe could we have a third commuter rail station that would better tie Boston and Cambridge into a single city from a transportation and commute standpoint. And we're saying maybe we can wait 20 or 30 years to solve that problem. That sounds nuts to me. And so I think we're really missing leadership from industry to go push our political actors and say, this is stuff that's got to get resolved. Some of this is fairly easy, and please don't build a gondola in the seaport. Let's fix the trains first. I think
You're anti-water transportation in the seaport?
No. I'm anti-gondola.
Oh, the gondola, the aerial tram thing.
I don't think we should build little systems that go over people. I think we should build massive systems that can actually move people. And if we could do that in a way, then what we'd end up with is a city that works significantly better. So I just landed, I was in Hong Kong 36 hours ago. And in Hong Kong, the development cycle was such that the folks who built the trains got the rights to build massive towers on top of them. And so you have an incredibly well-integrated transit system into the way the city functions. And I think if we had more of that, instead of thinking about small patchwork solutions, working on mega projects, the Big Dig was a huge mega project. It was really expensive, but without it, we wouldn't have the seaport, and we wouldn't have the Boston of today. But the question is, what's the next mega project that unlocks the next generation of prosperity for our ecosystem? And we don't, I mean, think about that. What's in the queue? What's in the queue that you can look at and say, wow, after 10 or 15 years goes by, we're gonna look at this and say, wow, the city's been reshaped and it's been remapped.
Well, it's the Harvard expansion across the river into Boston where they're building their engineering, and it's a lot of what MIT is doing in Kendall Square, but that doesn't really address the transportation infrastructure and where are these people going to live.
And how do we get there?
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's true. We see a lot of point solution, and we are in other areas, like you were mentioning Hong Kong or Singapore would be a good one as well, where we see more holistic planning than we see here.
Yeah, right.
Everybody sort of is in swim lane, right? But
say that again at swim lanes?
No, we see like industry, government, etc., in their different swim lane, but less sort of, I would say, cross
Looking at the
discussion
ecosystem
across
as a
the
whole,
entire
holistically.
ecosystem, right?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think if Singapore annexed Boston, the greater Boston area, they would look at a lot of T stops that already exist and say, why isn't there a 20-story apartment building here and a 30, 40-story office building next to it? You have these T stops on the Red Line south of downtown where, there's nothing at the T stop except for maybe a parking garage.
And sorry, I was ranting a bit, but I want to say one more thing because it's really interesting. If you look at European planning around transit, this is a big part of the debate around North and South Station being disconnected. Today, if you come from Washington, D.C. by train, you have to stop at South Station because the trains don't go further north. And so what it means is the commuter rail that runs from the south of Boston stops in Boston, and you have to move through Boston and then get back through. A lot of European cities connected this. So if there was a link between North and South Station, the commuter rail train that starts in Providence could go all the way to Manchester, New Hampshire without stopping. which would mean that instead of parking trains at North Station and South Station all day to get people, you could have the trains run through. And that would mean that your commuter rail would do what it does as a loop in Chicago and move people through the city in addition to getting to and from the city.
I feel like you might be running for mayor, Stas. Or governor, perhaps. These
Not
are some
running,
really
but
good ideas.
we gotta work
All
on this
right,
stuff.
can we draft him before the end of this meeting is over? I want to touch on some of these other questions here. The person who's playing devil's advocate, if you're a biotech startup facing Boston's high cost of living for very limited real estate space, why choose Boston instead of Research Triangle Park in North Carolina? Is the questioner from North Carolina, perhaps? Yeah, you know, and do you have any office space that's available for, say, a 200-person synthetic biology? Yeah.
Yeah.
Why do people put up with it?
You know, honestly, I think a lot of it actually goes to two body problems, right? So if you're trying to attract someone and their significant other or their spouse, you know, both of them need jobs. They might be both highly educated. Like you have a cluster like Boston, yeah, it's a high cost of living, high real estate costs, but you know, they can both find exciting, you know, jobs that they're passionate about. And so I think that's the value of clusters, honestly, is that, you know, you can attract the person, you can attract their spouse, they probably build a friend connections here and whatnot. And so I think that's some of the power of clusters is that ability that it's not just about attracting the person, it's attracting their family, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting because that's a question you could ask to any cluster, right? Because they
Yeah.
tend to be all expensive, all high cost of living, etc. So it's a very generic, and still they work.
Yeah.
And they continue to attract.
I literally just got an email as I was coming over to this event from somebody who lives in the Bay Area and is leaving the Bay Area for Manhattan because it's a cheaper place to live now, which is insane. They should know about Research Triangle.
The scary thing that I heard was that a startup founder came to me for advice. They're starting their biotech company. They actually thought they could find cheaper space in the Bay Area than in Boston for like small amounts of lab space. And I was like, really? We can't compete on real estate costs in the Bay Area? I don't know if that's just a niche problem or not, but it's something to think about.
And I don't think it's just, you know, a Research Triangle issue. I think even closer to Boston, you have these cities like Worcester, Providence, Manchester, where like you could rent really cheap office space, you could set up lab space. A lot of companies like Alexandria and others have tried to set up lab space in these places. And you just don't get quite the information flow in those cities that you get in, you know, being in downtown Palo Alto or being in Kendall Square.
But even here, I mean, if you look at, remember the Biogen experiment where Biogen moved out to Weston and then they tried to run buses to Kendall Square and that worked for like a week. And then they got a new CEO who didn't live in Weston and they moved all the way back to Kendall Square. And so I think, you know, what we're seeing today is we're seeing interdisciplinary innovation. And interdisciplinary innovation and collaborative innovation only works if I can walk down the street and run into my friend and say, hey, can you give me some advice? I'm working on this problem and I like don't get it. How would you think about this? And if I can't have that conversation by randomly bumping into this person, it might take us 6 weeks to schedule it because she's busy and I'm busy and like when are we going to see each other next and like when are we going to cross paths? And so one of the things that happens in the Boston area and why Kendall Square ends up being so successful is that I can walk out of my building and I can run into the 50 best people in the world who can help me think through this problem on my way to lunch. And so that means that I'm happy to pay prices that make Manhattan look cheap to be in Kendall Square, and that's why people are doing it.
I do think it's funny in tech, you see that sort of information network advantage that we have in biotech in Boston, where it's just, you know, you can't quite have a tech company in Cambridge and travel out once a month to San Francisco and sort of sponge up all the information and then come back here. You just have to be in it every day, I think.
And honestly, that serendipity, that being able to just run in and see something new that you hadn't seen before is probably more important to the corporates.
Yeah.
Because really, I think we have a particular mindset, we have a particular way of thinking, and really, it hasn't been until we moved into the ecosystem and really just spent time on the ground, interacting with the ecosystem. You know, that's so valuable for and very unique here. Again, this compressed ecosystem is very
Let's see if we
important.
can take some quick answer questions here. I'm going to take the one with 5 votes. Is there a plan to collaborate with other Boston universities in creating an even larger innovation ecosystem? No. Next question.
Yes.
I tried. I mean, like, I don't know. Do you guys know examples of you know, the universities getting together in one room to say, like, hey, how do we solve the talent shortage or how do we solve the transportation issue?
Not.
But they should. You should convene the meeting.
Carl, do you know of examples?
I think it's more faculty to faculty. It's the interaction with faculty like at
Yeah.
Harvard or MIT.
Yeah, so faculty, Carl is saying that it's faculty to faculty, lab to lab collaborations. I think the universities, when they collaborate, it's mainly like, let's not have our commencement on the same day so that, traffic is totally gridlocked.
I do think we see collaboration at the student level, though, right?
Yeah.
I sit on the board of MIT Sandbox, and a lot of the teams we see come through that
Yeah.
are both MIT and other universities from around. So I think the students are smart enough to know that there's talent in the ecosystem that they should be interacting with.
Yeah. The 3-vote question, any idea to use the Charles River for this ecosystem? Brian does have a paddleboard for hire if you need to go anywhere from here to Watertown. Do you have an hourly rate? 1/10 of a mile rate?
By the stroke, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fantastic idea.
Per use.
Let's see if we can spend some time. Well, maybe this is a quick one for Stas. How do you choose where to locate the next CIC? Can you do that one in like a minute or less?
I can do it in 30 seconds. So basically, we look for partners in cities that are building the future of the world of innovation with enough density to make it interesting. So if you're a city that's like that, come talk to me afterwards.
What's the newest city you guys have announced that you're going to?
So we're opening in Warsaw in early next year, and today is the first Venture Cafe in Warsaw. By the way, the Venture Cafe in Cambridge, 3 to 8 p.m. today, just across the street, and today's focus is esports.
Esports.
Yeah.
Can you raise your hand if you've been to the Venture Cafe before? All right, raise your hand if you haven't been before. Because it is, I mean, it's a really unique thing. It's about 500, 600 people that show up every Thursday night of the year, mostly for free beer, but the networking is also good.
Well, we also have free
There's-
wine. So
And free wine, yeah.
but really good company just across the street at 1 Broadway in Cambridge.
Highly recommend it, and I'm not compensated to endorse the Venture
Except
Cafe.
in free beer.
Free beer, yes. And finally, let's take this one. Is there enough skilled labor and risk capital available in Boston, given the boom that you describe, or are we experiencing constraints to support this growth? Do you think one or or the other is more of a constraint? Reshma?
Look, there always should be more skilled labor and more risk capital. I don't think you can ever have enough, right? It's sort of the grease that drives innovation in this town. So I mean, in some sense, you'll never have enough, but on the other hand, we're pretty rich compared to a lot of places. So.
Yeah. I guess I'm curious on the Phillips and Schneider side, do you have success if you're trying to get somebody to relocate from, Chicago, New York, San Francisco to come work in Boston or from Europe? Can you do it, or do you have to sort of hire people who are already here?
No, we haven't necessarily had a problem to date in attracting talent into the ecosystem. I do think, though, we need to think a little bit more creative around what scaling means, right? So there is a finite capacity to the amount of skilled labor that could physically be here, but in a connected world, particularly on the software side, we're getting smarter around how to utilize ecosystems and connect talent that we have around the world to solve the scaling problem.
And that's exactly right. I mean, we don't have any problem to attract people. I mean, of course, cost of living, depending from where people are, living before moving to Boston might be a problem, but usually it's not it's relatively easy. It's quite easy. But what we're trying to do indeed through digital and sort of leveraging marketplaces or some other community management is to try really to drive multi-local. On multi-hub, on sort of this idea of, yes, the main hub is in Boston, but we can have multiple satellites and we can have people working from multiple places. So we believe in critical mass, but we also try to have an ecosystem that's not just in one city, and again, try to be able to connect with people digitally wherever they are.
There are a bunch of other good questions here, but I feel like we're running out of time. I love this tie. I just want to talk about this question for a second. Why are we talking in terms of us versus them, the Bay Area, versus actually developing a collaborative joint ecosystem? It's an interesting question for people who've spent time in both places, and there kind of is a little bit of the Yankees-Red Sox phenomenon between San Francisco and Boston.
I love West Coast Boston. San Francisco is great.
Yeah.
It's just us on the West Coast with less snow and more rain. So it's totally fine. Love those guys.
I'm all for collaboration. I say the advantage of Boston is you can actually get to the ski areas faster than you can in San Francisco. So if that's your thing,
But they get to Burning Man faster. So it's really, it's like a trade-off.
Yes. All right, that's an important point, I think, to end this panel on. The two last things I want to mention, we basically have been the warm-up act for Helen Grainer, who I think is coming up next. So hopefully we did okay, and we'll get hired again to be her warm-up act. I want to thank you for all the great questions. If you check out the copy of Innovation Leader magazine and see our ranking of the top cities for corporate innovation around the world, I'd love to hear what you think. You can send me a Twitter message, Scott Kersner, or just email scott@innovationleader.com. So we'd love to hear your take on that list, but please help me thank these 4 amazing panelists.